Well, Comic, this series has officially gone off the rails. Overanalyzing rather simple characters is one thing, doing the same for an over-discussed meme lord is another, but Charizard? That's not even a character! Yeah, you got a point there, Strawman. Charizard isn't a character in the same way most characters are. Like pretty much any Pokemon, Charizard is not an individual, and therefore doesn't have a single defined personality. Might as well write a deep dive on Yoshi, but not like the main Yoshi, like one of the other Yoshis. Next time on Character Study, Light Blue Yoshi. No, stay with me. Pokemon is one of my favorite intellectual properties of all time, and while there are several individuals in the series I could have made a more traditional video about, you might have noticed that most of the character studies I've written have spawned from ideas that I had a decade ago. So, the year was 2011, and a little site called IGN was one of my favorite ways of distracting myself from my overwhelming engineering college workload. Yeah, I know a lot of you don't like IGN, I'm not a big fan of them anymore either. But in the wake of Pokemon Black and White's rather polarizing debut, IGN decided to make an event out of one of their articles, the top 100 Pokemon of all time. No way this was gonna make anyone angry. Rather than the IGN writers choosing their favorites, they determined the top 100 through a sort of randomized one-on-one voting system. Basically, you could go to their voting page, it would show you 2 random Pokemon, and you chose which one you thought was better. Better based on what? Doesn't matter. You could vote like this as many times as you wanted, and IGN compiled the data to determine which Pokemon was the most popular with voters. Not sure if that's the most reliable way of determining the best Pokemon, but I remember logging in day by day as they announced the ranks in groups of 10. Top 40, top 30, top 20, and then finally, almost predictably, the grand prize winner at the very end was none other than Charizard. And people went nuts.
Charizard does not deserve this at all.
A wild Gen 1er has been spotted by the name of IGN.
The list is basically legendaries, pseudo-legendaries, and Charizard.
At the beginning of this vid, I was like, if Charizard is number 1, I will freaking kill myself. Now I'm all like, goodbye world.
To this day, this is based as
C's number 1.
What the Charizard number 1? I'm waiting for some legendary.
Every time there's a Gen 1 Pokemon, take a drink. And every time you think of a superior entry, take a drink.
IGN. We chose Charizard because he was the highlight of our nostalgia. Me.
use a stealth rock. Oh look, now the number 1 slot is free.
List is full of nostalgia.
Not lots of people like Charizard. More people like Aquas more.
I know nobody is going to read my comment, but I'll write it anyway. There's a reason why they are called IGN. I, G, and N are the first letters in ignorance.
Watch out, everybody. We got ourselves more Gen 1ers.
WTF, half the Pokemon are legendaries
Why in
and
the world is
Charizard is the
Charizard
biggest
number
disappointment
1?
for
I'm glad you were the
only
only
Pokemon
Pokemon
with
with
that
the ability to
This
move
should
on from
include
your
You can say
childhood.
whatever you want.
Gen 1,
Yes,
50% legendary, or
and if they should
pseudo-legendary.
pick any
Explain to
track
Archie
and
Plain.
take Charizard like no other one.
Sucks.
This is all from the video version of the top 10, by the way, which is the easiest way for me to find comments. Not the worst like-to-dislike ratio I've ever seen, but considering that only monsters would take time out of their day to dislike a YouTube video, yeah, I said it, those are some pretty bad stats. I get it though, aren't you tired of seeing Charizard everywhere? Then again, maybe you aren't, because for every overrated comment was an innocuous yay Charizard, and then a much less innocuous attack on those people attacking Charizard. And befitting of the flame Pokemon, this ignited a flame war. The die-hard Pokeweebs versus the Gen 1ers. One of the saddest schisms in fandom history. Now this script probably isn't the same as it would have been if I belched it out right there in 2011, but 9 years and 3 generations later, this Pokemon's penchant for polarizing prejudiced plebes perpetuates as its most prominent pastime, especially now when the mainline games themselves are at their most divisive with longtime fans. Pokemon is a battleground now, and I believe Charizard is the key to understanding it. Why do you love Charizard? Why do you hate Charizard? Why do you wish Game Freak would cool it with Charizard? And what can Charizard tell us about the Pokemon fanbase? Let's ride this idea and shed some light on the mystery. Wait, Charizard can't learn Flash. Let's break through this mystery and carry home some answers. This is Character Study.
Presented by ComicFoil. Welcome to Character Study. Choose your character. Charizard. Game set.
So like I said, Charizard isn't a single character. It's a species, one of currently 896, I think. This just dated my videos significantly. 896 species of Pokemon. Since there are hundreds, perhaps thousands of Charizards in the world, we don't necessarily have character traits for Charizard as a whole like we do with Sans or Zangief. So instead, let's focus for now on what a Charizard is. At first, Charizard isn't even a Charizard. Most Pokemon start as one species, and if certain conditions are met, they evolve into a stronger species. So before it's a full-grown Charizard, your buddy is an ornery Charmeleon, and before that, it's an itty-bitty Charmander. You get the puns, right? Almost all Pokemon names are puns. Charmander's a pretty clever idea, though. See, a salamander is a kind of lizard, amphibian technically, and as such is cold-blooded. It's unable to generate its own heat and needs to find external sources of warmth. So imagine you're an explorer in pre-modern times. You fall asleep by your campfire, and while you're asleep, the campfire goes out. The ashes are still nice and warm, so a bunch of reptiles and amphibians burrow in to heat themselves. You wake up, grabbing your cooking pan from the extinguished heap, and see a bunch of salamanders scurrying out. You might now be under the impression that salamanders are born of fire, or have some power over it. Even Aristotle and Pliny the Elder write about this rumor, though they say it's only a theory with no real proof. Still, this sparks the salamander to appear in various mythologies with some sort of fire affinity, or even have its name given to magnificent beasts. So what is Charmander? A salamander who carries its own campfire with its tail, without which it will die. Even as a kid, I always found that morbid. And eventually, it becomes the sort of magnificent beast some thought salamanders to be back in the day. But also, a dragon. Yeah, dragons, one of the most popular and omnipresent creatures in mythology. Which mythology? All mythology. Something Oscar and I touched on when we wrote Top 10 Dragons, and something I'd like to go a little deeper into someday with another character study. That's a long way off though, don't get excited. Through millennia of stories and cross-pollination of cultures ancient and modern, we now have this fairly standard idea of a European dragon, and Charizard checks off every box. Scales, claws, wings, horns, fiery breath, in every way a dragon, except mechanically. There are 18 elemental types in Pokemon, including a dragon type. Charizard is definitely a dragon, I don't know what else you would call it, but it is not a dragon type. Charmander and Charmeleon are fire types, Charizard is a dual fire and flying type. This is largely because the first two generations of Pokemon games were rather withholding of the dragon type. It was supposed to be a big deal, resistant to 4 other very common types, and weak to only itself and the fairly uncommon ice type. And also fairy type, but that didn't exist yet. So in Gen 1, only the super rare Dratini and its evolutions got to be dragon types. It would be kind of unfair to give you one as your first Pokemon. Oh, I didn't mention, Charmander is a starter Pokemon in the first generation of games, Pokemon Red and Blue. And for the completely uninitiated, generations, gens for short, is how we divide the Pokemon series chronologically, where each gen starts with 2 versions of the same game, and introduces a new region of the Pokemon world, some new mechanics, and on average 100 new species of Pokemon. One of the traditions is that each game presents you a choice of 3 Pokemon to be your starter, a grass type, fire type, and water type. And for Gen 1, your choices were Bulbasaur, Squirtle, and Charmander. If you want to skip the rest of the video, here's the simple answer right now to why Charizard is so divisive. This choice right here. Pokemon was crazy popular in the late 90s. Not that it isn't really popular now, these games always sell like hotcakes, but back then, well, we had a term for it. Pokemania. It was everywhere. On TV, in the theaters, on shirts and cards, and the kids wouldn't shut up about it. I know, I was one of the kids. Parents were mystified. They weren't used to a foreign property being so popular with the kids. Even things that came from Japan before this, people didn't even necessarily know it was from Japan, or it was fairly underground like most anime at the time. But now, anime was in the streets and in your homes! Some adults were getting scared like this was a game of Civ and Japan was about to win a cultural victory. And this was before nerds took over the world and it was considered normal for adults to wear Captain America t-shirts. If you weren't there, you have no idea what a sensation this was. It was chaos, and it was great. Kids were trading cards, exchanging trivia, making up fake cheats, and oh, who was your starter? Trading in-game Pokemon was encouraged, but fairly cumbersome in a time before Wi-Fi enabled gaming, and the only way to get a starter Pokemon was to choose it at the beginning of the game. You want a different one? You gotta start over. So unless you were crafty with multiple game copies or able to convince someone to part with their best friend, you were only getting one of these 3. Bulbasaur, Charmander, Squirtle. And when they evolved, Venusaur, Charizard, Blastoise. The fact that this was all you were getting, you had a loyalty to your choice. You had to love it because it was all you were gonna get. Plus the emotional connections of starting your journey with this little guy that got bigger and stronger over time with you. So people got defensive about their choices, in a way I don't think happens as badly now, but it still happens. If you buy an expensive car, you're going to insist that it's a good model of car. Mac or PC, I'm sure you're opinionated. Heck, fast forward to Pokemon Go and look how tribal people got over what team they were on, which literally had no difference to them them whatsoever. So, who was your guy? Bulbasaur, Charmander, or Squirtle? At the time, it seemed like Charmander was the most popular, though I can't really prove that now. I actually ran a series of polls on my Twitter account a couple months ago, one for each generation of starters, and while it's always pretty close, except for Tepig apparently, oof, poor guy, Charmander was actually voted the lowest in the Gen 1 category. Weird. From my recollection, the Charmander line always felt like the loudest of these three camps. It was like the franchise itself was backing this Zippo lighter lizard, and I'll explain why in the next section. What I'd like to do for the next few parts is track Charizard and his utilization in the franchise throughout the 8 existing generations, both in the games and in Pokemon's larger media identity. But for now, keep this in mind. If you were a Charizard fan in the 90s, you probably cared very deeply about that choice. If you were a Venusaur or Blastoise trainer back then, maybe you don't harbor any hard feelings towards the non-dragon, maybe you do. But if you weren't there in the 90s at all, I don't know if you can completely understand this obsession, nor can we understand not understanding it. And that's where the disconnect between fans starts. It's gonna be a bumpy ride, folks. Strap in. Pokemon is first and foremost a video game franchise. In fact, some fans don't want to acknowledge any fans of the show or the card game, unless they play the mainline RPGs. I think that's another point of failing to understand other fans, but let's move on for now. The first RPGs to release, kicking off the whole franchise, were Pokemon Red version and Pokemon Blue version. Here are the boxes. Charizard is on the front of Red, Blastoise on the front of Blue. Sucks to be you, Venusaur. Actually, in Japan, they originally released Red version and Green version, with Charizard and Venusaur on their corresponding colored games. And then later there was a special edition Blue version in Japan. Apparently they scrapped Green for the Western release because Red and Blue are more popular colors here, and they're not wrong. But already this has Charizard appearing more in marketing than either of the other two starters. Sticking with the Western releases, since I'm a Western boy, a lot of kids getting into Pokemon in the West were finding out about it from other kids. They were going into these things knowing at least what their starter would become. It's not a spoiler, the final evolutions were all over the marketing. And I think it's fair to assume that some players who are otherwise on the fence might pick the starter that appears on their cartridge. Again, Red or Blue was another limited choice, and people tend to defend their choices when they're limited. It worked for me at least. Bulbasaur is my favorite Pokemon of all time now, but starting out, I had Blue version, so I picked Squirtle. Also, there wasn't a ton of media with forest-themed heroes or monsters kicking tail in 1998, so it was hard for 8-year-old me to wrap my head around the idea of grass-type being strong. Water too can also be a more passive element, but fire. You don't mess with fire unless you want to get burned. And like, sure, don't dive into the deep end of the pool if you can't swim, but fire is gonna hurt you way faster. Going purely by dumb kid logic, if you wanted to beat all the other Pokemon trainers, you went with Charmander. Burn it all! There's also the little topic of color theory. Red is a warm color, which tends to inspire action, whereas blue and green are cool colors, slower, more thoughtful. If this sounds too hippy-dippy, it's not. Color theory is used in psychology and marketing all the time. Just look at Target, which builds its marketing strategy around trying to get you in and out as fast as it can. Red, as opposed to blue-clad Walmart that wants you to spend more time in the store and methodically search for deals. It's a thing. So I think there's a slight psychological disposition to see Charizard as stronger than Blastoise or Venusaur. And then you just look at them. Charizard is a frickin' dragon, no matter what the typing says. It can fly, and it looks like it can move pretty fast without sacrificing much strength. Blastoise is no slouch either. We got Gamera with cannons over here. But how can it compete with the symbol of fantasy and imagination, the dragon? This is the final boss of a D&D campaign. Venusaur, well, I like him now, but when I was a kid in the 90s, like, what is he? Lizard frog thing with a tree on its back? I'm sure it's powerful, especially once you learn about Solar Beam, but it doesn't look like it can really move. Even modern iterations of the games and anime have trouble selling this guy as a mobile threat. Again, these are all snap judgments and not everyone's going to have the same thought process, but the scales tip in a certain direction. Funny thing is, if you're playing Pokemon Red and Blue picking Charmander because you think you'll be the best at battling, you're in for a rude surprise. Fans like to say that choosing Charmander is the hard mode of Gen 1, largely because of the type-specializing gym leaders. Assuming that you're using your starter as one of your main team members, this puts Charmander at a disadvantage for the first two gyms. Brock uses rock types, Misty uses water, both of which are strong against fire. Comparatively, Squirtle will do well against the first gym and can at least tank the water moves of the second gym, and Bulbasaur can utterly destroy Brock and Misty, and tank Lieutenant Surge and Erica after them. Bulbasaur, I guess, would be the easy mode, so unless you want to really over-level Charmander, you're going to have to depend on other Pokemon, which against Brock is especially daunting, since most of the early game options aren't good against Brock either. Might make you pretty jealous of the other starters with their quadruple damage to Geodude and Onix. In fact, the remakes even moved to fix this imbalance by letting Charmander learn Metal Claw, a Steel-type move that beats Rock. Sure, the Charmander line will make short work of Eriga, but by that point you've had the chance to catch plenty of Pokemon, so the advantage is kind of moot now. Also, Fire is good against Ice, but since most Ice types in Gen 1 are also Water types, that matchup can easily blow up in your face. So does this mean picking Charmander is bad? No, it means you have to work harder, and there are plenty of challenges Charmander excels at. Just immolate all the bugs in Viridian Forest until you have a Charizard that can hang with the big boys. In Pokemon single player, anything is possible when you level grind, and you probably have an even greater respect for them now because you've worked so hard to overcome these obstacles. That's the main games of Gen 1 out of the way, but Pokemon is not an island, and I think it would be remiss to ignore the other, in some ways more prolific areas of the series. First, the trading card game. Like everything else Pokemon, the card game is still around, but is nowhere near the same cultural touchstone it was in Generation 1. And the card everyone wanted in Generation 1 was the ultra-rare holographic Charizard. Not that the TCG was super balanced anyway, but compare the starters in the base set cards. Venusaur and Blastoise are just sitting there. Charizard has this dynamic pose, and 120 HP! Kids are gonna gravitate towards big numbers, and at the time Charizard was tied with Chansey for the bulkiest monster in the game. To this day, first edition original Charizard cards are a badge for elite collectors.
Oh my god! We did it! We did it, baby!
Just as omnipresent was the TV show, and considering that the Adventures of Ash Ketchum were largely a toyetic device for advertising different Pokemon you'd want to collect in material form, the use of Charmander is notable. Nothing compares to Pikachu, of course, he's the series mascot, and I'm surprised I didn't name drop him until now. But in episodes 10, 11, and 12, Ash conveniently captures the next three most merchandisable Pokemon, the Kanto starters. All three are well-remembered episodes, but I feel that Charmander's is a bit more intense. You got this trainer, Damien, who gives up his Charmander for being too weak. Man, screw you, Damien. Then Ash has to protect this heartbroken Charmander while he waits out in the rain. And may I remind you, a Charmander can die if its tail flame goes out. Then Charmander bonds with Ash, battles Team Rocket, and when Damien comes back impressed with Charmander's new power, Charmander gets to blast him away with all the catharsis of Julia Roberts in Pretty Woman.
Big mistake. Big. Huge.
While Bulbasaur, Charmander, and Squirtle are all prevalent in the first three seasons of the anime, I feel Charmander gets just a little bit more. Notably, he's the only one that evolves and gets kind of a character arc. In his teenage Charmeleon days, he stops obeying Ash's commands, and though he evolves into Charizard to protect Ash, it's clear Charizard only cares about battling strong opponents. He'll be Ash's ace in the hole one day, then cost him the entire Indigo League the next. Come on, Charizard, you could have been a contender! Wake up! In a Season 2 episode, Charizard and Ash finally resolve their differences and gain mutual respect again, and from then on out, Charizard is Ash's deployable super weapon. This would have made things too easy for Ash and Johto, admittedly, and entering into Gen 2, the show needed to start advertising some new Pokemon. So Charizard, like Butterfree, Pidgeot, and Lapras before him, gets an episode devoted to his leaving the party, staying in the Characific Valley to train with other Charizards. Squirtle and Bulbasaur would later get their own goodbye episodes to make room for new members, but every once in a while they come back, and whenever Charizard returns, it is spectacular. In Pokemon the Movie 3, Charizard is a borderline Deus Ex Machina for an intense fight with Entei, and for the Johto League Championship, Charizard gets to finish off Ash's rival Gary, and throughout the rest of the series, Charizard will occasionally reappear just to remind you how strong he is. Similarly, even though the Kanto starters weren't available in the Gen 2 games directly, you could trade them up from Red and Blue and they would do just fine against newer threats. So for the next few years, these three would be treated semi-equally in the games, even if Charizard always got a bit more exposure and spin-offs and the like. Like, Pokemon Snap didn't have Blastoise or Venusaur, but it sure as heck had Charizard. And look at all this merchandise. I swear, these t-shirts never had Venusaur, sometimes had Blastoise, always had Charizard, with his mouth open like a screaming goat. But this wouldn't last forever, and for a time the dragon would go to sleep as we entered into Gen 3, and the introduction of the rotating roster. Generation 3 kicked off with Pokemon Ruby and Sapphire in 2002, and what a wild ride this was for a 12-year-old me. It was a mere 2 years after Pokemon Crystal, but the massive fandom of Pokemon had shrunk to a more appropriate size for a popular RPG franchise, and for some reason I had it in my head that Game Freak was done with Pokemon after Gen 2. That was the original plan after all. I was relieved to learn that there would be a new pair of games, but this relief came with a new uncertainty, as the Hoenn region only seemed to feature 67 of the pre-existing 251 monsters. Sure, there was 133 new critters to collect, but what happened to the other 184? No Dragonite? No Gengar? No Scizor? And no previous starters! Charizard was gone. And not just in the games, in the show too. A new pattern had started, where rather than each member of Ash's team getting a full episode send-off, Ash would drop off his entire team with Professor Oak, save for Pikachu, and build a brand new team over the course of each season. So I figured Charizard and the others were discontinued forever. It seems silly to think now, but I had watched plenty of shows where characters were plain old forgotten about before. I can remember trying to rationalize it with myself. Wait, Meowth is still in the show, but he's not in the Hoendex. But he still exists, right? So that means others can still come back, right? I soon came to understand that Pokemon had entered the era of rotating the Pokemon roster. Every generation, a truckload of new Pokemon would be joined by a random selection of old favorites, with the remaining trickling back in over the following years. I mean, come on, it's not like Game Freak would make a game that didn't at least support transferring all previous Pokemon in the series. I don't want to talk about that right now. Soon enough, Pokemon Coliseum made it possible to get all the Johto gang back, and Kanto got a spiffy remake in the form of Fire Red and Leaf Green, fixing many of the problems with the original titles. Hey look, Charizard is on another box. But Charizard was no longer the head honcho, and the next few generations didn't feel any need to give him special attention. He was just another mod now, and that's okay. By Gen 4, Pokemon was 10 years old, and Pokemania had long since subsided. Now might be a good time to consider the metrics. You had fans who stayed with the series no matter what. Let's call them the Ashes. Then you had fans who were around for Pokemania, maybe Gen 2, but moved on. Some people like to call these Gen 1ers because they are only familiar with the first few years of a very long-running franchise, but we'll instead call them the Garys. And like the anime, I don't want to outright villainize the Garys. Gary was growing up, he had his own path to follow, and maybe Pokemon just wasn't part of that path anymore. Maybe he'd rather use his free time playing deeper games with more mature content, or maybe he was really career-focused and stopped playing video games altogether. Maybe he still looked in on the franchise from time to time, but also maybe seeing all these new Pokemon was intimidating. The series didn't wait for Gary, it kept growing and changing, and if Gary didn't want to take the time to learn new Pokemon games, let alone a much more complex battle system with abilities and a physical special split, I think it's understandable for Gary to keep his distance, or just play the original on his Game Boy Color he found under his bed from time to time. You do you, Gary. But then consider that there is a third group. This is a franchise aimed at children after all, and since the series started, more children have grown up and experienced these still popular games and shows. We'll call these fans Dons. For Don, this was what Pokemon was to them, with rounder creature designs and no particular reverence for veterans like Charizard, save for a few bits of favoritism in the spin-offs. Heck, the anime had its own version of Charizard for Dons, Infernape, who had a similar origin being abandoned by a strong trainer, and a similar rise from Nervous Spitfire to Powerhouse Inferno. I wasn't really following the anime at this point, but many fans contend that this is the Charizard story done better. So while Ash and Don are traveling Sinnoh, Gary is off doing his own thing, and all three of them have a very different idea of what Pokemon is to them. Now maybe Ash's and Don's might debate from time to time over minor squabbles, but the differences would reach a boiling point with the release of Gen 5. Real ballsy move from Game Freak here, and a ploy to recapture that feeling of a brand new world that Ash's and Gary's had felt 14 years ago, Pokemon Black and White would feature an entirely new selection of Pokemon, with none of the previous 493 available in the game until the post-game. For the first time in a decade, all players were equally unfamiliar with the flora and fauna of a new region. Now, most Garys normally wouldn't have been interested. They were happy to stay out of things until now. But something about this ice cream cone just wasn't gonna fly with them. I mean, think about this. Why do you think Pokemon Go was so popular that one summer? It's not because it was good, it's because it was free and easy to understand. People who hadn't heard the word Parasect in years could just hop right in. Now, of course, not all Garys fly to the internet to yell at kids for liking the wrong fictional animals, but some of them who might have been willing to dip their feet back into the franchise felt truly alienated by the admittedly different creature designs that populated Unova, Vanillix and Garbodor being particular targets of ridicule. Now, I would argue that Unova is an amazing region, that more so than any region before it has a unique identity and narrative themes that tie into a story about how people and Pokemon would coexist in a metropolitan society, logically leading to Pokemon that are conditioned to live an urban lifestyle and culminating in a fascinating if not fully explored moral quandary about being a Pokemon trainer in the first place. But how do you expect someone on the outside to understand that? They just see a Pokemon that looks like a candle, and they're confused. It's like while Gary was away at college, somebody renovated his precious childhood skate rink into a Zumba studio, and he was very upset. You can't expect a series to just stay in stasis while you're gone, but I can understand being a little bit melancholy about it. This is the point when IGN had its poll, by the way, and without making this an outlet to yell at IGN, it's important to consider that IGN was a news outlet for all kinds of media, for children and adults, and the Pokemon poll was on the front page, so the Ashes, Dons, Garys, and everyone in between were all voting in the same poll. And there's one more side of this we should consider: competitive battling. Looking at competitive meta pre-2002 is pretty funny, actually. Without everything instantly uploaded to the internet, it feels like you're an archaeologist interpreting the hearsay of people who went to Nintendo Cup and stuff like that. Oh my, it seems the ancient battlers of Gen 1 sometimes used Charizard as a sweeper with sword stance, but it suffered against popular picks like Stormy. Competitive just didn't get a lot of coverage back then. But later, better battle mechanics in the series and a more supportive worldwide web made competitive much more of a scene from Gen 3 onwards. The game certainly got more interesting with weather effects and hazards, and while I'm no expert when it comes to the meta, I can safely assume that if you played competitive Pokemon in Gens 3 through 5, you did not use Charizard. This is because the meta was defined by a single move, Stealth Rocks, which hurts every Pokemon that switches out until another move like Rapid Spin is used to deal with it. There were tons of strategies, but you had to be prepared for Stealth Rocks when forming your team. And Charizard, a fire flying type with 4 times weakness to rock moves, was not prepared. If you were using Charizard in competitive battles, it was a signal to everyone that you didn't know what you were doing. Blood in the water, here come the sharks. So in the IGN poll, the Garys are thinking, oh yeah, I remember Pokemon. I remember Mewtwo being really strong in the movie. I remember Pikachu being really cute. I remember using my team against the Elite Four, and the team Ash used in the Indigo League. And for all the reasons I listed in part 2, that very often meant Charizard. Now, if you're a Dawn who's into the competitive scene, a Charon, let's say, what do you mean you like Charizard? He's freaking useless! And if you're a more hostile Gary who's not afraid to talk tough to randos online, we'll call them Giovanni. What do you mean you like this weird metal plant thing? What even is that? Apparently, anyone who liked the new Pokemon just didn't know what Pokemon was supposed to be like. And anyone who picked Charizard or Mewtwo was just a nostalgia-blind old fart. And for me and any other Ashes who picked Squirtle or Bulbasaur back in the day, well, I'm not gonna lie, it was pretty fun to watch. But the ramifications of this debate, I think, would continue to echo for the entire rest of the Pokemon series. As much as some haters would like to think Black and White failed miserably, Pokemon continued to be a very successful multimedia franchise. Gen 5 persisted with a less well-received anime, which eventually brought back Charizard, of course, and follow-up games that incorporated more older Pokemon as usual. Also, it's worth noting that Charizard had become playable in the Super Smash Bros. Series, at first alongside other Kanto starters in Brawl under Pokemon Trainer, then as a standalone character in Smash 4, since I guess Squirtle and Ivysaur were less important to keep around. Don't worry, everyone is here again for Ultimate. Now, I'm not saying Game Freak saw the IGN poll, but they certainly noticed at least some of the chaos from their throne on Mount Olympus, and as Pokemon took on a new polygonal look for the 3DS and Switch games to come, measures were made to try and bring back the grown-up 90s kids who now had expendable incomes, and that meant some Gen 1 love. Emphasis on Kanto, especially starters, especially Charizard. X and Y allow you to pick a Palatown starter pretty early in the campaign, which coincides with its other revolutionary feature, Mega Evolution. Several returning Pokemon, but particularly Gen 1s, had new forms to make them bigger, badder, more competitively viable. This included Venusaur and Blastoise, that's awesome, but Charizard, strangely, didn't get a Mega Evolution. No, he got 2. What the heck was that about? And they're so good! Mega Charizard Y gives him an amazing special stat, along with an ability that suits him for the ever-popular Weather Team. And Mega Charizard X finally makes Charizard a Dragon type. Both of these forms do very well in competitive. Maybe not as well as Talonflame, but still. And while you'd think that would win over some of the Charons still steaming over that poll, I think for a lot of them that was just salt in the wound. Oh, this guy. Now he's muscling in on my tournaments. Hell no! Oh, and here's a Mega Charizard in the Pokemon Origins special. Oh, and here's another Charizard in the anime kicking Ash out of the Kalos League. You new fans really like Greninja? Sorry, Charizard beats him. For the record, second place on the IGN poll was Mewtwo, also got 2 Megas and was featured in a new movie around this time. I'm not saying, I'm just saying. Now Gen 7 isn't as Char-centric, except maybe those ride Pokemons, but there's still a big appeal to the old guard. Alolan forms, created to breathe new life into stale chips, are only created for Gen 1 monsters. At least Galarian forms in Gen 8 spread the love to other Pokemon, but now I have to talk about Pokemon Sword and Shield, and dear God, have I dreaded doing this. So listen, I see people on Twitter say all the time that they don't want politics in their video games. But Pokemon, one of the least political games ever, has fans making up their own politics. Hand to God, the nastiest debates I've had on my Twitter account have been over President Trump, Black Lives Matter, and Pokemon Sword and Shield. Something is wrong here. Next to the common complaints over less than impressive graphics and an incomplete Pokedex, one of the most common talking points of Gen 7 seems to be the continued favoritism towards Gen 1. Squirtle and Bulbasaur didn't take long to be patched into the game. But not only was Charmander there day one, Charizard got a fancy Gigantamax form and appears as the ace Pokemon of the Galar League Champion, the final boss of the game. You finish the game when you prove you can beat Charizard. Yeah, I know, Venusaur and Blastoise got Gigantamax forms and updates, but Charizard might be equally relevant to this game as the box legendaries. There's more Charizard in this game than Pikachu. Mind you, I think it makes sense to pick Charizard for this role. Galar is modeled off of the UK, of course. You got the champion that looks like a king, and a city that looks like a castle, and a European-style dragon really fits the bill for final boss. And as much as I understand the criticism surrounding this game, and even agree with a substantial amount of it, Charizard as the last Pokemon you fight in the championship really works for me. Leon is one of the most competent champions in series history, at least battling-wise, and this colossal dragon is every bit the awe-inspiring obstacle dragons were written to be in Arthurian legend. Only a true hero could overcome it. You're not just gonna beat him with some water or rock type. He's got G-Max Overgrowth ready for that weak sauce. And like I said, the favoritism was only about the third most divisive topic here, so maybe the heat is off Charizard for now. The fandom found new pastures to war over. I can't be the only person who was genuinely moved by some of these ads, showing players across the entire series joining together for the franchise's true jump to consoles. I guess they'll always be fighting. It is a series about battles after all. Fitting for Charizard, who in most depictions is highly combative, to be in the fray of most major feuds in the series. In the 90s, it was just Charizard versus Venusaur and Blastoise. Then Charizard represented the old fans versus the new. And now, I see Charizard in Game Freak and the Pokemon franchise itself. Flashy, magnificent, inspiring to the imagination, but perhaps more interested in larger gestures of exposure than the fine details of game design. Charizard nested itself in Galar, and now wages war on behalf of Game Freak supporters, against those fed up with their practices, who demand more care put into the new adventures, and less time spent on the third goddamn Kanto remake, goddammit! But you know what? Heck if I don't see both sides of it.
Yes, I am Ash, and now that I'm 10, I can finally get my Pokémon license. I will journey to gain the wisdom of Pokémon training, and I hereby declare to the Pokémon of the world, I will be a Pokémon Master.
So now I've decided that my first Pokémon should be a fire Pokémon that will help me live up to the name my father gave me.
If that little Pokémon was that hard, then you have to at least try. Amazing!
It evolved into Charizard.
You mean to tell me you're a Charizard trainer and you've never even gone flying on your Charizard yet? It can't be that hard! No!
You've made a devastating mistake in your life. You have saved Charizard for the final match.
I wanted it to be Charizard! I win this with Charizard, or it's meaningless!
You understand that this victory of yours was not just your own doing, don't you?
We've been together since you were a Charmander, and all I want to do is be good enough for you, so we can battle side by side, as a team.
Charizard is still on its feet! Charizard hasn't given up yet? So what am I doing?
Now I'll show you what Charizard can really do!
I already had this end section recorded, but while I was editing, a weird thought came to me. When I was a little kid, sure, Charizard was one of the Pokemon I'd see all the time in promotional material, but the first time I saw one in context of anything, the first exposure a lot of 90s kids had, was in the anime, Episode 17, Island of the Giant Pokemon. And this was the same clip they used in the opening of every episode, a mountainous Charizard spewing flames down, Ash barely getting out of the way on the most audibly tense line of the theme song, "Our courage will pull us through," right before we see Squirtle for the softer "you teach me, I'll teach you." Charizard is clearly a peril. It'll require all our strength to overcome it, and we should be so lucky to one day command one ourselves. Here's the thing though, that Charizard from the actual episode isn't real. It's a robot, a theme park attraction. According to the Pokedex, Charizard is only 5'7", something the games are very aware of. The first Charizard most of us ever saw wasn't real, but then again, Pokemon isn't real. And that's not to just dismiss the whole argument. I more than anybody know the difference fiction can make for us in real life. But even being very versed in the stats and strategies of real Pokemon, who am I to say Charizard is overrated because he isn't good? That feeling of wonder we had watching the Pokemon opening is as real as Pokemon itself, which is to say it isn't, but it's still very important. In this video I used an analogy of Ashes, Garys, and Dawns to compartmentalize the fanbase, but in truth Pokemon is too massive to do that with any real accuracy. Describing a group of people with some umbrella adjectives isn't going to account for the thousands of individuals that comprise it. There are as many ways to experience this franchise as there are people experiencing it. Some people passed on Red and Blue but got into the series with Heart Gold. Some got into the series after playing Pokken Tournament. Some exclusively watched the show or played the card game. Some are only interested in challenge runs now, like Nuzlocke. And some just took their kids to Detective Pikachu and wanted to see that dragon incinerate Ryan Reynolds. We live in the age of Twitch now, where you can be a fan of a game without even playing it. And I know, when we look at Charizard, we want to argue about him. His design is conflict incarnate, it just makes us ready to fight. But luckily, Pokemon as a fandom is not a physical space. There's room for all of us. So why should an older fan looking back care if their favorite is 4 times weak to Stealth Rock? And why should a newer fan care if the scene of Ash in the igloo with Charmander made us cry? That might not be part of their experience. We gotta have some perspective here. We can debate, sure, Charizard would love that, but when we return to the Pokemon Center at the end of the day, all wounds need to be healed. And speaking of those conflicting opinions, IGN may have retreated into obscurity as far as Pokemon polls are concerned, but the Pokemon Company themselves have been conducting their own elections every year for some time now. Granted, not as many Garys are going to be on the Pokemon website to participate. I'm a pretty avid fan and I didn't even know about it until recently. As of 2020, Charizard is still among the upper echelon, number 4 in fact, but above him are 3 more recent Pokemon that, true, have gotten some special attention here and there, but also show a much more diverse spread in preference. The whole top 30 contains what feels like a fitting mix of the golden oldies, new models, legendaries, powerhouses, cutie pies, and total memes. Much more the eclectic selection I would hope to see for a series that appeals to so many different players and viewers. So, okay, maybe we should cool it with updating the same Pokemon over and over again, give some other favorites some care, but it is kinda neat that, more so than any other Pokemon I think, Charizard has kept evolving since its inception, to the point where it finally is that gargantuan creature I used to think it was. Pokemon as a franchise shows no sign of stopping, and even if we let this lazy lizard rest for a bit, I think we'll always be feeding that fire at least a little. I mean, he'll die otherwise. Charizard doesn't always need to be the top Mon, he can take a rest, but when we need him again, the Charcific Valley is never more than a day's flight away. Hey guys, thank you so much for watching. This one was a challenge to get out while my family and I were getting sick with COVID, so I'd really appreciate you sharing this to everybody you know and leaving a comment below about your thoughts. Like him or hate him, Charizard's a big deal, so I'm sure you think something about it. I used a ton of Pokemon footage from dozens of YouTubers, but 3 I want to highlight are Munching Orange, Zach Scott Games, and Yus. Big thanks to the voice actors I had at the beginning, my D&D friends Joe, Oscar, Kayla, North, Yumi, and Luck. You should really follow them all on Twitter, they're a ton of fun. Except Joe, who doesn't have a Twitter, but he's still a ton of fun, so I just put his full name there. Oscar, of course, is the GreenScorpion, who also voices the announcer in my intro. Make sure you check out his channel, he'll have a great countdown about ARMS coming up real soon. The song in my intro is Cascade by Kubbi, and the character study logo was designed by Tales of Socholo. Give him a follow too. Make sure you're subscribed for the next character study. Right now I'm working on one so big I'm bringing along a very predictable collaborator. It's Oscar. Oscar and I are going to do one together. And since that might take longer to make, I'm also writing a shorter study. Not sure which one will be out first, but there's a lot of powerful stuff coming, so be there and be square. Laters.